Hey, 7th grade, Mr. Hersberg here. Today is Monday, May 11th, 2020, and this marks the last week of new material for you guys. Starting on the 18th, that's a week from Monday, you will be given your final project for me. It'll be divided into two parts. But that's not till May 18th on Monday. So this will be our last week of new material. We'll still have our journals, and I figured since we finished up the Pigman, this will be a great opportunity to go ahead and start a new book, and this is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. We should be able to finish it by this coming Friday. It's a very short story, and it's only about, I've included a free ebook for you. It only goes to about, I think, 30 pages or 40 pages, and there's no reason, yes, it's 49 pages, and if we do 15 pages a day, we should be able to cover, or 10 pages a day, we should be able to cover most of this. So let's go ahead and get started with our journal. This week's standard is Reading and Informational Text 7.6. And as you remember from last week, this is we're just scaffolding, we're building on top of this standard. Read each description today. You're going to number your Google Doc 1 to 4. Read each description, you're going to determine the author's main purpose. Is it to entertain, persuade, or inform? Remember, EPI. And so when an author sits down to write something, he or she has a job to do. They're deciding, why am I writing this? Why am I sitting down, putting my pen on my paper, or opening up this blank document to type? What do I want my readers to get from this? And that's going to be your job today. So let's do the first one together, and we'll decide which one is it. A coming-of-age story about a teenager who spends a day alone in New York. What's the author's purpose? Well, we can definitely know it's not to persuade, because their coming-of-age story, they're spending a day alone in New York. We know it's not to, I would say this one could have multiple answers. I would take either to entertain or inform. I'd slightly lean more towards entertain because it's a coming-of-age story of a boy who spends a week. There's going to be some time alone in New York. There's going to be some entertainment value out of this. But I definitely would say it's to entertain. It could be informed too, but it's going to be your job to tell me why you picked that, okay? So you're going to get four first sentences of a story and then argue which one it is and why, okay? All right, great. Let's get started with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So some of you may have heard of this story before. It's by the author Washington Irving, who is an American author, and we call him the father of American literature, exactly as he wrote them. With 6 handsome illustrations in this version I'm going to use. You guys have a free ebook I've included. The Headless Horseman is the one we're going to be dealing with, and the teacher, Ichabod Crane. So some of you may have seen the movies that have been made about this and heard about the stories that go with this. It's a great story, and I think it's a great way to cap off the year for you guys. So let's get started. We're going to try and get to page 10, and then, like I said again, there's only 49 pages in this. There's definitely, we can definitely finish this by the end of the week. Let's get started. A pleasing land of drowsy head it was, of dreams that wave before the half-shut eye, and of castles in the clouds that pass, forever flushing round a summer day, castle of indolence, found among the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson River, at that broad expansion of the river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, and where they always prudently shortened sail and implored the proclamation of St. Nicholas when they crossed, there lies a small market town of rural port, which by some is called Greensburg, but which is more generally and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given, we are told, in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country, from the inveterate prosperity of their husbands, to linger about the village tavern on market days. But, that is, it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely avert to it, for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from the village, perhaps 3 miles or so, there is a little valley, or rather lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just a murmur enough to lull one to repose and the occasional whistle of a quail, or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound you'll ever hear, and it's all tranquil. I recollect that when a stripling, my first exploit in squirrel shooting was in a grove of tall walnut trees that shades one side of the valley. I wandered in it at noontime when all nature is particularly quiet, and was startled by the roar of my own gun, as it broke the Sabbath stillness around and was still prolonged and reverberated by the angry echoes. Now, if I ever should wish for a retreat, I might steal from the world as its distractions and dream quietly away the remnant of a troubled life. I know none of more of a promising than this little valley. From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lands are called Sleepy Hollow boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land, and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say the place was bewitched by a German doctor during the days of the settlement. Others, that an old Native American chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some bewitchment that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them all to walk in a continual reverie. They are given all kinds of marvelous beliefs, subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in all the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot, meteors glare often across the valley than in any other part of the country. And the nightmare with her whole ninefold seems to make the very favorite scenes of her gambols. The dominant spirit, though, that haunts this enchanted region and seems to be commander-in-chief of all powers in the air, is the apparition of a figure on a horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper, whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever and anon seen by the country folk hurrying along in the gloom of night, as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at adjacent roads, especially to the vicinity of a church that is no great distance. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of these parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning the specter, allege that the body of the Hessian trooper had been buried in the church, and that the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in a nightly quest for his missing head, and that the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow like a midnight blast is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the church before daybreak. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, which has furnished materials for many a wild story in that region of shadows, and the specter is known at all the country firesides by the name the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It's a remarkable thing that the visionary propensity I have mentioned is not confined to the native inhabitants of this valley, but is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time. However, wide awake they may have been before they entered the sleepy region, they are sure in little to no time at all to inhale the witching influence that is in the air, and to begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams, and to see apparitions. I mentioned this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is not in such little retired Dutch valleys, found there and there, embosomed in the great state of New York, that population, manners, customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement, which is making such incessant changes in other parts of the country, sweeps by the unobserved. They are like the little nooks of still water, which border rapid streams, where we may see the straw and bubble riding quietly at anchor, or slowly revolving in the mimic harbor, undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not find the same trees, the same families, vegetating in its sheltered bosom. In this place of nature there abodes in a remote part of American history, that is to say some 30 years since, worthy of the name Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing children of the vicinity. He was actually a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the mine as well as for the forest, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodsmen and country schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane was not inapplicable to his person. He was tall, exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders. He had long arms and legs that dangled a mile out of his sleeves. He felt that he might actually have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small, flat on the top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon its spindle neck to tell to which way the wind blew. To see Ichabod striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for a genus of famine descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow taken from a cornfield. His school was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, his windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. It was most ingeniously secured at a vacant hour by a withe twisted in the handle of the door, and stakes set against the window shutters, so that, though a thief might get in the perfect ease, he would find some embarrassment in getting out. An idea most probably borrowed by the architect. Joust van Houten, from the Mystery of an Aesop. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant place, just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close and a formidable birch tree growing at one end. From hence the low murmur of his pupil voices, coning over their lessons, might be heard in a drowsy summer day like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of their master, in one tone of menace or command, or peradventure by the appalling sound of the birch as he urged some tardy student along the flowery path of knowledge. True to say, he was a conscientious man that ever bore in mind the golden maxim, spare the rod or spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars certainly were never spoiled. I would have not imagined it, however, that he was one of those cruel potentates of the school who joy in the smart of their subjects. On the contrary, Ichabod administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burth off the backs of the weak and laying it out on the strong. Your mere puny stripling that winced at the least flourish of the rod was passed by the indulgence, but claims of justice were satisfied by inflicting a double portion of some little tough, wrong-headed, broad-skinned Dutch urchin who skulked and swelled and grew and dogged and sullen beneath his birch. All this he called doing his duty by their parents. And he never inflicted a chastisement without following it by the assurance so consolatory to the smarting urchin that he would remember it and thank him for it in the longest day he had to live. When school was over, he was even the companion and playmate of the larger boys, and on holiday afternoons would convoy some of the smaller ones too, who happened to have pretty sisters or good housewives for mothers, noted for the comforts of the cupboard. Indeed, it behooved Ichabod to come on good terms with his students. The revenue arising from his school was small and would have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread, but he was a huge feeder, and though lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. But to help him out of his maintenance, he was, according to country custom in those parts, boarded and logged at the houses of the farmers, whose children he instructed. With these lives successively, a week at a time, thus going the rounds of the neighborhood with all his worldly effects, he would tie up in a bag. All this might be too onerous on the purses of the rustic patrons, who are apt to consider the cost of schooling a grievous burthen and schoolmasters as mere drones. He had various ways of rendering himself useful and agreeable. He would assist farmers occasionally in their lighter labors on their farms, helped to make hay, mend the fence, took the horses to water, drove the cows from the pasture, and cut wood for the winter fires. He would lay aside, too, all the dominant dignity and absurd sway with which he lorded in his little empire. The school and became wonderfully gentle and ingratiating. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers of the town by treating the children right, particularly the youngest and, like the lion, bold, which, while wilsome, so magnanimously the lamb did hold. He would sit with a child and rock a cradle with his foot for hours. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the whole neighborhood. He picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young children of their psalms. It was a matter of no little vanity to him on Sundays to take his station in front of the church gallery with a band of chosen singers. In his own mind, he completely carried away the palm from the parson. And his voice resounded far above the rest of the congregation, and there were peculiar quavers still to be heard in that church, and which may be heard half a mile off, quite the opposite side of Mill Pond, on a still Sunday morning, which are said to be legitimately descended from the nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, divers the makeshifts in that ingenious way which is commonly denominated by the hook and crook. The worthy pedagogue got on to tolerably enough, and that was thought by all who understood nothing of the labor of head work to have wonderful ease life to it. Ichabod, generally a man of importance in the female circle of a rural neighborhood, became considered a kind of idle gentleman, of vastly superior taste and accomplishments to the rough country swains, and indeed inferior in learning only to the parson. His appearance, therefore, is apt to occasion some little stir at the tea table of a farmhouse, and the addition of a supernumerary dish of cakes or sweetmeats, or peradventure the parade of a silver teapot. Our man of letters, therefore, was peculiarly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. How he would figure among them in the churchyard between the services on Sundays, gathering grapes for them in the wild vines that overrun the surrounding trees, reciting their amusement the epitaphs on the tombstones, or sauntering with a whole bevy of them along the banks of the adjacent mill pond, while the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance and dress. From his half-itinerant life, he was a kind of traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip from one house to another, so that his appearance was also greeted with satisfaction. Ichabod was moreover esteemed by the women as a man of great enumeration, for he had read several books all the way through, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he was firmly and potentially believed in all witchcraft. Ichabod was an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple credulity. His appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in the spellbound region. No tale was too gross or monstrous for Ichabod's capacious to swallow. It was often his delight, after his school was diminished in this afternoon, to stretch himself on the bed of clover bordering the brook whimpered by his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's driveful tales until the gathering dusk of evening made the printed page a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he watered his way by swamp and stream to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered, every sound of nature at that witching hour fluttered his imagination. The moan of the whippoorwill from the hillside, the boding cry of the tree-toad, the harbinger of storm, the dreary hooting of a screech owl, or the sudden rustling in the thicket of birds frightened from their roost. Even the fireflies, which sparked most visibly in the dark places, now and then startled him, as one of uncommon brightness would stream across his path, as if by chance a huge blockhead of a beetle came wriggling his fingers to give the ghost with the idea that he struck a witch's token. Ichabod's only resource of such occasions, either to drown thought or drive away evil spirits, was to sing psalm tunes. And the good people of Sleepy Hollow, as they sat by their doors of an evening, were often filled with awe at hearing Ichabod's melody and linked with sweetness long drawn, floating from the distant hill or along the dusty road. So I'm going to stop there. It's giving us 10 pages in. Gives us a little bit of backstory on Ichabod Crane and the town of Sleepy Hollow, or Tarrytown, as they called it. Ichabod's a teacher. He's from Connecticut. He's tall, skinny, got a huge nose, and he likes to eat a lot, even compared his hunger to an anaconda. Metaphor there. And also said he really likes to impress the women of the town with how smart he is. He'd go and read poems and read the inscriptions written on tombstones. And this town is obsessed with witchcraft. And guess who can read all the witchcraft in the world and believes in it? You got it, Ichabod. So he'd get everyone's attention, more so the women's, by taking really good care of their kids at school. And then he'd start reading them things out of the witchcraft book, which they love to hear. And then he'd go to church and impress people even more with his abilities to sing and his ability to be musically inclined. So everywhere Ichabod went, he seemed to impress people, mainly the women. I think that goes unnoted lots of times. I think Ichabod is not seen as much of a womanizer, but he likes the food that the women provide him as well. So I'm going to stop there. We haven't met the Headless Horseman yet. We've only heard that he is a Hessian trooper. Hessian just means he's Germanic, or from Germany. That during the Revolutionary War, they got his head chopped off by a cannonball. So a cannonball came, fired, and knocked his head off. And he goes back and forth from the church to the bridge to look for his head because he's buried at the church. Hope that's interesting to you guys so far. Answer the questions I'm going to have set up for you. If you don't understand something about this book, I'll be at a Google Meet from 1:30 to 2 o'clock. I will see you guys later.